resources that are happening. Now it's Sam's turn.
Thanks, Claire. I'll also mention that I recently did some work in the USERA guide, working on mostly on atraventris and rosier, including a couple things and excluding a couple that I thought were distracting or confusing. And I'm working on the hoplitas now, so updating information in particular on pilosifrons, producta, and truncata, and identification of those, which I thought was confusing. And I might drop out some of the trickier states of the clipial margin and just merging them because I think they were divided too finely. Super interesting, I know, to everybody. Actually, it is for this group. What am I saying? Okay, so Trachandrena.
I have one more little announcement. There was a very long period where the videos weren't making it up onto the Elmira site. These are completely up to date now. And also, we found a nifty way to use AI to go back and make transcripts better. But time is always a limiting factor. So if anybody has a student who needs something to do, I could walk them through how it works. It's just a little time consuming, but way less time consuming than going through it manually. So if anyone's interested in that, let me know.
I'll say. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And go to this particular view. And you should see, Claire, do you see the spreadsheet?
Sure do.
Okay, so everyone has access to the spreadsheet. It's also, a kind of thing that you can modify too. So feel free to change things, move orders around, add additional characters, drop ones. It's your spreadsheet. We have been going through just plugging through the different species. I have to say I love the Trachandrena females, and going through one-on-one. We're now on Andrena Miranda. For anyone who hasn't been here, basically what you're looking at is a spreadsheet with characters in the columns. You can see the character at the top. At the bottom is some simple information about what that character, how it's measured, or a little more explanatory information to explain the heading. There are a bunch of different characters here, some of which are pretty subtle, but the idea is this is a subtle group. So you want to use that string of evidence to help identify it. So you don't want just splitting things on one character, because a lot of times it's a little ambiguous and there can be variation in the amounts. So it's better to weigh a whole series of things and say, yes, this makes the most sense. We also, don't forget, we have the other species that the particular species in the row is similar to. We also have highlighted in yellow key characters to be looking for in addressing the identification of the species at hand. So with that, glad to answer questions if that comes up too on that. With Miranda, if we skate through here looking for yellow, we really only see this. So T2 oppressed area. I have a Miranda under the scope. We'll take a look at T2, and that's pretty broad, 0.75 to 0.9. And if you look here, we do have a range, but a lot of times these specimens are kissing up to 0.7 or 0.75 or firmly within that range. And then there's a bunch that fall below. So in itself, it's not going to give us an identification string. So we'll look at several other characters. Miranda tends to be northern and I think midsummer in a lot of ways. But a lot of these species, these Andrena species in particular, unlike their cousins, which are more spring-oriented, tend to be more mid-year. So let me take us to the microscope. Maybe I'll shift the specimen a little bit here. Better look at the abdomen. And I'll bring down the focus. Okay, so what we're looking for here is another sort of just general character of Trachandrena is that the oppressed area of the rim, which under most circumstances for most bees, and most bees have an oppressed area. So by oppressed, we mean slightly the elevation of the area along the rim is slightly below the rest of the area. Or another way to look at it is there is some demarcation in the rim area that shows a change from a lower, i.e. depressed portion of the rim to a more elevated area above it. And often with that are changes in pitting density and patterns like that. So these are subtle, and so it often doesn't show really well in a photograph or a like we are looking at now with his a video grab. But if you look here, you can see that something's going on right about there. And that's indeed, it's the change from this is areas depressed and this is elevated. And you can also see like, oh, look, there's a lot of pits up here and the density is a lot fewer down here. These are smaller too. So what we're looking at then is what's the ratio or what's the percentage that this depressed area comprises of the entire segment. The entire segment sometimes is difficult to come up with a measure because the segment of T2 and all these other segments, they can expand and contract underneath the previous segment in different ways. So for example, if we go down here to T3, this is pretty clearly the rim of T2. So and this is, remember these things go under each other. So T3 is under T2, but this area right here is probably a portion of the abdomen T3 segment that is more pulled out than normal. So we don't see that up here. You don't see this bare area and this fringe, little bit of hair is maybe peeking out. So just to give you some indication that you can't always come up with some absolute measure because this distance varies in the situation of how retracted it is or extended from underneath the previous segment. In this case, though, you can see that this is is comprising a pretty high volume. We could say, 0.75, no problem, maybe even more like 0.8. You can measure it, but usually these ID keys are designed to be done by eye. Note the bright white hair patches on to the side. So we can see here distinct hair patches. There are no other yellow ones, so nothing that we thought was amazingly distinctive here. If we scan through, we see pitting on T1 as the first one. If we go back here, we're looking at this. The distances are really close to a little bit expanded out. So here you can see a variety of distances in there, but we're saying 0.75 to 1 pit apart. When we look here, maybe we'll go a little closer. We can certainly find that range in the, here very close, here more expanded out. So yeah, reasonable in that one. Distribution, not pertinent to the topic at hand, active in the summer as a special note. This Miranda is part of a group, including Virginiana, that tends to be pretty generic. So sometimes you really want to have comparative specimens. So if we look at Virginiana as our out group, the one we're trying to contrast, that's the same. That's the same. So borders of triangles absent, long tall, long carinae in the rectangles, sputum pitting 0.5, but here it's 0.2 to more than 3, which is sort of sends a little red flag that maybe something's going on, that maybe we have more than one thing going on in Virginiana. Fovea distance 0.5 to 0.75, so not very much. Certainly not like rugosa and Heraclei, which we looked at before. So not a lot to go on. So if you're looking at something that might be Miranda, you should be, here's a difference though. Well, actually, no, it's not. So it's just had more digits in the number, 2.5, 2 to 3, right? That's not also very illuminating in most of these things. So these things are pretty darn close. Slightly greater than 1.5 versus 1 to 2. It's very, and Hippodes, but that has a red most of the time. Red and quintilis are also very similar. So when we're looking at these things, we would be looking at multiple projects. Let's see if we can find some difference. So they're pretty subtle. So here, for example, pitting on T1, we looked at this 0.75 to 1, and in Virginiana, it's averaging much larger, wider. So the spacing is much more set apart for those pits. So 1.5 to 3, so that would be a character you definitely would want to assess when looking at a specimen to see if it's Miranda or Virginiana. And that's about it. You don't have a whole lot to go on. I guess, oh, actually, wrong. Look at this, 0.9 to 0.75. This is 0.6 in Virginiana. So that is, so it looks like you have a couple things. I think you should make this yellow then here. What was the one I was going to make yellow? 0.75, 1 to 3. Oh yeah, this one should be yellow. I'm going to do that right now because we have agency to make changes. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to Miranda. Next, we go to one of the most distinctive ones, Nuda. And I'll pull up a specimen after I put the labels back on. This. Don't want to lose track of things. And this goes back into Miranda pile, which I had out, and Nuda. Nuda, I'm going to guess in general, um, in several Nuda species that use the last name Nuda, usually end up being specimens that have relatively few pits on the scutum in the bee world. Whether that's exactly the derivation of the name, I don't know, but it does at least rhyme with the right answer, perhaps. Okay, so here it's the sparse pitting that's really the key. So here you can see the yellow is designating an important character much greater than 4 apart, and you'll see that it's almost none. And are sparse, and that is the sparsest of all of these. So almost right away you can tell what it is. And I'm not sure. Let's see, vertex height is pretty low. Most of the species have a greater than 1. This has a vertex height, so that's the distance between the back of the head and the lateral ocelli, and it is much closer to the back of the head than a lot of the others. So we'll look for that. And is there anything else? Well, we have a T2, a pressed area that's quite wide. And that's about it. So let's take a look now on our screen. Bring the mag down, try and get our specimen in there. It's not in center. There we go. Bring this up. Okay, so we're looking at the scutum primarily. It's a little bit of a oblique shot here, but it is super easy to see. There are just, we'll bring the power up here. There is some dirt on here, but even with the dirt, it's pretty darn clear. This is an old specimen. Pretty darn clear that these pits, there's just really a few here and there and there, and mostly the surface is smooth and unblemished by pitting. So very easy to tell from that point of view. We said the vertex is, look at the very broad spacing on these carina, those cells that are made by the raised lines. We have a short vertex. Let's take a look at that and bring that into view. I can do Control F. Let's see, Control F to get us a full screen on this. And indeed, we have a good shot here. There's a piece of dirt in the viewfinder. Dirt's right there. There's the ocelli. There's the back of the head. If we look at this ocelli distance here fits in this slot between the two and a little bit more agreeing in general with a very short distance to the back of the head. As we said here, near the front, that one 0.75 to 1. So that's good. Then the last one that we had, but we really don't need it because we don't need to see it. But again, it's good to just review the characters. Is we have such a strong character in the scutum pitting density. But let's take a look at, because the depressed areas on the rim are just, it's like we want to look at those. And I'm going to zoom in here because there's so many variations in what could be going on. So what appears to be here is that I'm guessing that I don't see it well, that this is part of the depressed rim and is running almost all the way up to the edge of the, I'm going to bring in some more magnification here, up to the edge of the segment. Not clear, possibly just a bad shot, but it is supposed to take up 90% of the segment. We go back. So can't see it well. That could be it there. It seems to disappear up here. Usually you do see something. It's possible that it's just running right along the edge. So we'll keep looking at depressed areas to get better feel for that. I don't know that we need to spend a whole bunch more time on Nuda because it does have such a great character. Now we flip over to our spreadsheet. The next one is quintilis. Now quintilis, I believe, because I almost never see it, it's more of a Midwestern species. And it falls into that category of more or less difficult to ID. So let's take a look at the characters and then we'll see if we can find them. Taking off some of this material. I believe this also may be something found far to the west, but I'm not looking at the distributions right now. So when we look at quintilis, I'm going to go start at the beginning here and look for our yellow areas. So here, when we're looking at the internal parts of the propodial triangle, it says tall carinae, large cells not rectangular. So in other words, there's not that pattern of tall rectangles. And if you look at elsewhere, most of the other species have that rectangular aspect to the cell structure. So it's probably netted or something like that. Again, I will be interested as well as you. And then it's got distinct bands of dense white hair on T2, T3 with complete bands. So normally when you see these dense white hairs, they aren't complete. In other words, they are not running across the entire rim. They're just simply parked on the lateral edges. Let's see, mostly Midwestern, pitting all across T2, uniformly dense, pits almost touching. Okay, we got a lot to look at here. I'm bringing up a specimen towards the abdomen, part of that specimen, and I'm going to change the angle a little bit. And we're going to look for complete bands and dense pitting. Look at those dense complete bands. So that's very unusual to begin with. So there's T2 has a broken T3 and T4. I think that's what they said, T3 and T4, right? Well, oh, I'm not sure it means here, if we look up here, distinct bands of dense white hair on T2, T3 with complete bands. So you could read that as T2 and T3 with complete bands, but I believe looking at the specimen, you have T2 with bright bands, but not complete, and T3 with a complete white band. You also can see that throughout this segment, we have very dense pitting. And to, again, work with our, what is a depressed area? This would be the boundary here with the depressed area. And it sort of becomes hard to read there, but you can see the shadowing here. So if we look at this, I'm going to say this particular specimen, roughly 50%. Let's go back and see what they say. That's not one of the characters. Look at that, 50%. Other characteristics here, the not rectangular parts of the radial triangle, the dorsal proportion of the propodium, in other words. Okay. And I'm going to move it more to the center. So I'll orient everyone. And let's just bump up the magnification a bit. So here's what we're looking at. Scutum, boundary, scutellum, boundary, metanotum, boundary, propodium, and triangle of the propodium. This section here would be, I believe, almost certainly the vertical face that's facing the abdomen. And we just went out of focus. But now, if we look at the raised carina and the cell structure within here, you can see that basically this is just like a big netting, right? There's none of what you see in other ones where you see within the propodial triangle area what amounts to a series of long rectangles where the north-south or the, what would that be? Longitudinal raised carina striations are forming big cells, but here it's basically a net. So in other words, there's no particular direction to the dimensionality of the different veins, if you want them, or carinae. And it just is like a netted structure. Over here, that's a little bit more true, but we're really focusing on the middle part here. Okay, so I think also just a note, look at these thickened hairs up here. It's not something I mentioned in that guide, but that strikes me as maybe distinctive also, but I don't know. So I think we have looked at the key characteristics here for our friend Quintilis. Again, something I don't see. Yep.
Yep, let's interrupt for a second. Our friend Will asks about the column O, which is about the oppressed area. Is that the same as the depressed rim? I usually look for hairs or cite when I see that word.
Okay, let me go to the spreadsheet. So column O. Proportion of, so what was it? Can you repeat the question?
Are you using oppressed and depressed as synonyms, or what's going on there?
Yes. Sorry. Is that sloppy? Should it always be depressed? Is oppressed and depressed the same? Probably not. Otherwise, it'd be different words, right? So that's probably maybe better as depressed with one P. What is the difference between oppressed and depressed? Let's
So
ask
I
our
looked it up.
friend.
There you go.
Oh,
Look up for the Google.
okay. Oh, you want me to do it?
Yeah, that would be good to have it on the screen rather than me just reading it.
Okay. Are you depressed, Claire? You might be suffering from oppression.
I still enjoy things. I think I'm getting better at that.
Oh, I wonder if it's ad pressed. I think this is spelled wrong. Is that how it's saying that is not a word? Some English major, help us. Oppressed. It likes it as a word, oppressed, but Google doesn't. Depressed versus oppressed. It really doesn't show it. What does your Google version say? It says oppression, depression versus oppression. This is not helpful. Maybe we have to categorize it. Versus morphology. How about that?
All right, here are my quick definitions. Adpressed is, like, that's with a D, so not
Ah,
on the spreadsheet right now, is lying closely against an adjacent part or against the ground, such as scales. Depressed, the first definition is the clinical definition, but yes, to push or pull something into a lower position. And uppress is to press something closely to something else. So I think that's where we use that for the hairs.
right. Right. Okay. So anyway, I think I am convinced at this point that we should be just using the term depressed. If not, I mean, someone can email and that's might be a good, interesting bee monitoring notion. Oppressed and oppressed hairs. So oppressed hairs make sense. Hairs, we know what those are. Those are like the things on Epilus, Triepilus, and things like that. So hairs are flat to the surface. But are those oppressed, APP or ADP? Okay, we're losing focus here. But I think that's an interesting thing that'll have to be followed up. Any more on that, Claire?
There is consensus. I believe that we're going to change this and keep talking about hairs as oppressed. And we're going to skip this new word adpressed. We're going to ignore that one.
All right. Gene will look it up. Okay, so we're done with quintilis. Now we get to Rennie. So did I pull the specimen? I think I did. So Rennie is interesting because it is a Castanea specialist. So in other words, it's a specialist on chestnut, American chestnut, and also on chinkapin. And so that's why there was this big hiatus. Like no one could figure out why is there no recent records of. Oh wait, I put this in the wrong place. I'm gonna correct that. Quintilis, you go there. So Rennie is interesting. So anyway, if anyone is near any chestnut trees. We've been finding them on the plantations that people make for the back crosses of American and Chinese chestnuts, and also on chinkapin. So there's a short bloom period. Well, not that short. It's actually just no one pays attention for both. And they're late. They're June bloomers, which is in keeping with Trachandrena as being a late in the year species. And it was the last big blooming factor within forests. Okay, so what is different about Rennie? So 1.25 to 1.4 by 1. So it has a very long F2. So that's the second flagellar segment. The others are basically all 1-to-1. So there's a gimme right there. Vertex height also very long. So 1.5 to 2. The others, there's some others that are in that same category, but that's in general a pretty distant one, particularly when we were just up here with Nuda as being very short. So this is another cells not rectangular situation. T2 depressed area. Hitting on T1, widely spaced 2 to 4. All right, okay, here's some notes. Shallow facial fovea compared to others. Labrum may be broader than others. So we haven't seen that many specimens to track down some of these things. So let's look at, say, pitting on T1 first on this specimen. And it should be pretty widely spaced, and it appears to be so comparatively. 2 to 4, I think they were saying. I could see that. Over here, you can see it maybe the best. Okay, now we are in shooting distance of the propodial triangle, which should have that netted effect that we just looked at in the previous specimen, and that also seems to be the case, where you just have squiggles. There's no particular one type of dimension in those raised cells or reticulations. Then we jump to, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything, but the vertex height and to the antennal length of the second flagellar segment. Got some busted antennae going on in this very old specimen, which was collected on Castanea. I'll tell you at the end, what year period, because it's from Falls Church. Okay, so let's get this in focus. We may have too white of a background, but we might be able to see that. I'm going to see if I can change. There's a little bit hesitant. I'm going to pull another specimen.
When you pull another specimen, can we see T1 again?
T1 again? Sure. All right, and let's look at this one. I want to see where that one was collected. So that one was collected in Falls Church, Virginia in 1916 on Castanea pumila. So, but that's pumila is chinkapin, not, and dentata is the American chestnut. All right, what do we got here? This one has we should be able to see this one better against a black background. Also from Falls Church, looks like the same collection date. Is a collector, green. These are the things to think about, though, is that we're looking at an over 100-year-old specimen, and if you can get your specimens into a museum, then we will not we, but someone will be looking at your specimens in 100 years and gaining insight into your collection efforts. All right, so this is the scape, this is the pedestal, this is F1, this is F2. F2 usually length tie width is about 1:1, and you can see here, depending on whether you measure down there or up there, I'm not sure that we specified, but in either dimensionality, this length here is, and we're slightly not on this. In other words, we're looking down the specimen. You can see that's out of focus. So it's a little bit off in a way that diminishes the length, but you still can very clearly see this is clearly longer than it is broad. We go back here, we see in looking at Rennie here, looking at vertex height 1.5 to 2. Where was, oh, there we are, 1.25 to 1.4 by 1. So that's fits, and again, clearly longer than the others are going to be. Vertex height also should be extensively long. But everyone should be visiting. That's, interestingly, it is a question mark how important Chinese chestnuts are planted regularly. No one looks at them very much. They do appear to have specimens. Tracy Zerillo has found them on just a, random Chinese chestnut. And let's see, what we're looking at the vertex now. Yeah, I'm started doing two things at once. But it would be good to do more sampling on Chinese chestnuts. Okay, so note here, this is just that area below the central ocelli that we sometimes look at. Not smooth, rugged, hard to see, very dulled by lines and pits here and there. But if we look at this distance, you can see that this distance to this distance is much greater than the diameter of the ocelli. If we put in our pretend ocellis, it's like 1.5. And indeed there it says 1.5 to 2. That could have changed depending on the angle that we were looking at. You want to see T1 again? So that should be 2 to 4. Let's do that. The male has some interesting characters too that are pretty distinct, but I forget what they are.
And the other follow-up to the vertex height is you've highlighted that on the Rennie, but there's a couple others, particularly the Virginiana, that has that kind of depth. What? Why? What? I mean, we'll get there, but that's a question for later.
Yeah, well, I think so it's personal choice, not a algorithm. And I think the answer lies in that but obviously not was not the case in that first one, that Miranda one that we saw, that I would have chosen a set of yellow markers, yellow marking things that if you saw that combination, that would equal a species ID. So I think that's largely the case, but maybe not necessarily, and obviously not always, because that one was the thing. But I think that's the general idea. Okay, so this should be T1.
I wanted you to bring this back up because I think it relates to when we were talking to Joel about his definition of sparse, meaning more like it's inconsistent spacing. And you do have in your notes that it's the average number of diameters to nearest neighbor in central area, discounting the rim area. But I think you can maybe explain a little bit like where that means, and is this like the farthest distance that everything is apart, or since that one is a really distinctive
It
example
could
of
be
what that might
right.
mean.
It is something that when you talk about inner pit distance needs to be defined. Like is so if you're at a pit, you could one distance measure could be what's the nearest pit? Okay, what's that distance? The other would be, and that's the one I think that we're using. So what's the nearest neighbor average distance from any choice of pits? And it's several, in this case, it could even be more than four, but it looks, four is not unreasonable. It's very well spaced. The other would be I choose a pit and now I'm looking at, its neighbors, whatever that means, and looking at the number of pits between them. So the more consistent definition is to say if for a set of pits or for a particular pit, you're going to measure the distance to the nearest one, right? So that's just one measure and it's clear. There is one other pit that is going to be the nearest one. What's that distance? Then take an average will give you a description of the average distance. And maybe if it's very variable, you would want like a standard deviation, but that's going beyond, I think, what most people are willing to do in terms of time. But
Yeah,
I
I don't
think,
think we're doing that level of detail.
yeah. So does that make sense? I don't know what else you would do in terms of pit describing the distances between pits.
Nope, I just wanted it was seemed like a really good example there
Yeah.
to use to really nail that one in.
Yep. So, and the functional bottom line, these are pretty sparse and certainly not piling on top of each other. And we can compare that to other species and it's much less sparse. So I think we covered Rennie. So we should jump to Rugosa. And as the name implies, it should be, oops, I put that in the wrong spot. There we go. It should be pretty easy, or well, something should be very rugose, very rugged, very filled with topography on this. And indeed, we will see, well, we can go first to our spreadsheet. And again, you guys can make your own spreadsheets for anything. I find this useful when I really have a tough group with lots of possibilities just to find an anchor in terms of making decisions without holding too many variables in my mind. Okay, so here, if we just keep going and we go back here, so sputum pitting highlighted basically overlapping, so zero to overlapping, like no spacing whatsoever. We go here, P2, 0.75 to 9, so pretty long, depressed area. And when we go here, special features, it's basically saying, if we look up here to see all the words, that this is very rugose, so very sculptured, very ruggedy. I also know, although I don't think that I put it in here as important, that the distance to the rim of the eye is pretty wide. So let me pull a specimen. And I guess we'll start with the eye. Why not? Let's take a look at that. Get power down. And we are looking at the abdomen. Oh, hmm. Oh, there we go. Oh, this is convenient. Here's the fovea. This is the wide part. Remember, sometimes we look at the ratio. So it necks down quite a bit. We didn't highlight that when I talked about it. And it's very arched. It's not straight down, not paralleling this. So it very much arches out. And you can see that this is quite wide. So that's a good marker. Next, we will travel to the scutum. And what we should see is very rough surface, a lot of topography, lots of hills and valleys. And also the pits so closely spaced that they essentially are overlapping one another. And that does not look like the case. So I'm wondering if I have a wrong specimen here, because I'm going to pull another one. That just does not strike me. Am I missing something? They're close, but they should. I mean, my impression is there's too much smooth area in there. So I'm going to put this back on and we'll get another one and see if we see
In
something.
Discover Life, while you're looking for that, what it says
Yeah.
for rugosa to separate it from nuda and some other ones, that it's unique in this group for punctures on the scutum, large, coarse, overlapping, or separated by at most half a puncture width throughout, and that the punctures give rise to long hairs with minute branches, which sounds like maybe what we were looking at, but just a little bit farther apart than expected.
Maybe I overemphasize the roughness of the surface, because here on this second one, look at my other specimens here. It's essentially looks the same, but maybe a little closer. Maybe I should change that to be not so, to include a spacing that is not touch. The implication in that one, well, this one, interesting. I've got one that I'm looking at that does seem to fit the bill of like everything's touching another one. And then I have another one that I'm going to show on, well, I'll show both. Why not? So here is the second one. We're going to look at the scutum. And we can see essentially what is the same as the last one. Maybe a smidge. No, it's basically the same. You see all the hairs coming out of those pits, and it is very hairy. Some of the pits are touching, but a whole bunch of them are basically just close, always within half, that's for sure. Let's go to this other one that I have here and take a look at its pits. Then I have a bunch of old specimens that, just for qualification, I'll take a look at too. That's right. So here, kind of the same thing. There's some touching, some about the same. Hairs coming out of the pits. Let me look at these old specimens. And just look at them with a microscope rather than delaying things by going further. Yeah, I think the thing is that if you look at them from afar, everything looks like they're touching, but when you zoom in, you actually see, oh, you know what? There's spaces between a lot of these. Okay, I'm going to modify things. So, make sure I put it in the right place. Rugosa, and also, well, we'll take a look at this one. I believe we also mentioned, did we not, that it has a long. So first of all, we're going to modify this to be not 0 to overload, but 0.5. Look at us changing things on the fly. We don't like the things, we just change the definition. So we'll look at the depressed area 0.75 to 9. I think everything else. It says in direct comparison, surface of sputum is much more sculptured. I'm going to get rid of that. And make that, I'll change the color later. So let's look at depressed areas. Center it. So 0.75 to 9 is what we're looking for. And if we look on here, so T1, T2, this, I'll bring up the magnification, pretty subtle, depressed area. You can see it's roughly going right through there, and that would be somewhere in that neighborhood, 0.8, 0.85% value. Okay. So this is what happens with guides. They're never really finished as you go through. What time do we have, Claire?
It's time to wrap up. We got like 5 minutes.
Okay.
I said in the chat while you're finding something that since you've been talking, I found, and I've made these in my own little quick notes, that the associations, especially when you're just like dropping them casually, are super helpful. In some of these, you'll have like the a more geographic note in your quick guides. But you know, I wrote down the chestnut thing, and when they're associated with forests or springtimes. So those are things that you might want to take note of. And then on certain species guides, we have like kind of quick notes that are helpful as well. Okay.
Yeah. I'll also note for Rugosa that having looked at people's results and that Rugosa seems to show up a lot in canopies. I think we're still in infancy in our canopy exploration of what bees are doing, what the heck they're doing up there, besides getting caught in our traps. But Rugosa may be something to look at. But I can't remember if they were mostly males or included the females. We did some canopy stuff too and found unbelievable numbers of imitatrix, but they were, or slash Morrisonella, but there were almost all males. Perhaps they were nectaring. Okay, so next time we'll go through Sigmundi, which is tricky. It's a tricky one. Spiriana, Virginiana. Spiriana, I think, is a willow specialist. I could be wrong. So, anyone have any questions about this?
Not in the chat, but you're welcome to unmute. This is a tricky group. Fully support you unmuting.
The real tricky group are the males of this group, which I don't identify. I just call them track, except Hippodes, which has orange legs. Easy enough. It's on the list of things to investigate.
You do have a little spreadsheet for it, but it's not as clear as the one you're providing for the females.
Oh, I didn't realize I even had one. It's been that long. I think I've just given up for the moment. We hope to do some.
Maybe I made it myself. I don't think I did.
I don't know. I don't know. We hope to dabble in molecular stuff here. We're dipping our toe into that, but the molecular stuff that we'll be doing is in relationship to morphology and identification. So this is going to be one of our target groups in that effort, long-term effort, and it will be, let's start DNA barcoding a bunch of males, and then we will begin collections, and then we will have higher confidence that we're actually looking at a species of Trachandrena with a name of, well, that's consistent. So the names, I just don't trust even the stuff that's been identified so far. So that's the problem. Like if when we do a lot of guide work, we'll go to the Smithsonian or go to some, a collection that we've gotten or people have sent us specimens. The assumption is that those identifications are correct. But in a case like this, then what can happen is you have specimens, but they aren't correct. And then you get really just the rabbit holes are bottomless. But kind of fun for those of us who like that. And we hope more people are interested in that. Okay. Well,
Thanks, everybody.
it sounds like we're
Check
ready
out
to
all
go.
the Andrena links.
Thank you for today's lesson.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, new friend.
Hello.
Awesome. I'm going to stop the recording. Like I said, Elmira has been brought up to date, and I'm going to post this one immediately. So, yay! All right. Bye, guys.
All right. Thank you.